and I'm sure you caught, as Sarah was saying, and I'm sure you caught probably parts of that. I live in Etobicoke now. I've been in Etobicoke for over 35 years out near Centennial Park. Um, Born and raised in Toronto, not too far from Etobicoke, actually, in the city of Toronto on the Toronto side of the Humber River. But the last 35 years, my wife and I have been out here near Centennial Park raising our family. And as Sarah said, I was a paramedic for over 30 years, 25 of which was with the city of Toronto. And one of the last stations I worked at for many years was it's called 31 Station, which is located at Prince Edward Drive in Dundas, right on Dundas there. So I am a very proud Etobicokean. Started my career as a teenage lifeguard working at Memorial Pool, the Etobicoke Olympium, Lambton Kingsway Pool. So very much Etobicoke in the blood. And Islington United Church, I've known people through the years who've attended. And of course, I drive around that church all the time when I take the shortcut from Dundas to Burnthorpe. So that's a little bit about me. As Sarah was also saying, my debut novel, Perfect Shot, came out last November, and I'm very excited about that. It was published on November 14th, 2023. And I guess we'll get to talking about that. I'm sure we'll see Sarah momentarily. Um, what else about me? I have two grown children. My kids are in their 30s now. My daughter lives in London, England, and my son is in Port Credit. And both in the last month and a half, both got engaged at the same time to their respective partners who they've been with for years. But life being what it is and timing being what timing is, they both chose to get engaged literally within 5 weeks of each other. So my wife and I are a little shell shocked and proud and happy about what is to come in the near future. So that's the little short and dirty about me.
The other part of it is obviously you became a writer. You retired from what the stressful life that you professional life that you had, and now you've turned your passion for writing into actually having a book published. So
Hmm.
very exciting. But you've always dabbled in writing. You've always liked doing it, but it wasn't until I guess you had retired that you decided you wanted to take on this on a more serious role. And I guess you went to Thriller Fest in New York City in 2018. And at that point in time, you'd sort of got a manuscript ready. And then you went there, made some contacts, came back, it sounds like, and then managed to link in with an agent. And as a result, Perfect Shot came to be. You were picked up. I don't know who your agent was, but you were picked up by Minotaur Books, which is a very respectable publisher, and certainly very well known in the thriller genre. So it's certainly very, very exciting. And as we know, Alex is going to be back, but we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the interview. So I guess at this point in time, it's just a matter if you wanted to fill in or flesh out a little bit more about yourself, the writing process, how you came up with the storyline, and then from there we can dig into a little bit more details with regards to Perfect Shot.
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't I fill in a few of the blanks? So, I've been writing and interested in writing all my life, and just dabbled for many, many years. Tried my hand at a novel back in the 90s unsuccessfully. And of course, back then, the internet being what the internet was, there were no opportunities to really look up advice the way there would be today. So when I hit a wall and I couldn't figure out how to move forward, I had a very young family at the time, and essentially I gave up the writing at that time. But then 10 years later, I jumped back in and I started writing for a magazine. I was doing a column for a Canadian paramedic magazine, a national magazine, and got the bug again for loving to write and wanting to write again. And around 2014 or so about 10 years ago now, I started to write seriously again, dabbled in started lots of stories, didn't really go very far with them. And then, as you said, I found Thriller Fest, and that gave me my motivation to complete a manuscript and take that down to Thriller Fest in New York City and try to find an agent. Because as you know, in the fiction world, the agents act as gatekeepers to the publishers. So you can't, someone who wants to be a writer can't just send a manuscript to a publisher. They have to have a literary agent, and the agent on their behalf submits the manuscript to a publisher. So the literary agent really acts as a bit of a gatekeeper, but also in some respects, a bit of a groomer in the sense of making sure that whatever writers they have as clients are prepared and that their manuscripts are ready to be sent. And in that way, they keep the workload of the editors at the publishing houses down by not inundating them with, hopefully writers who aren't quite there. So I was lucky a number of years ago to find an agent at Thriller Fest at not my first one, but my second Thriller Fest. And I had a different manuscript at that time. My first manuscript in the Alex Martel series was actually called By a Long Shot. And it's actually in a binder right behind me there. Um, we went out with that. So my agent began submitting that to publishers February of 2020, which of course was the very first week of the pandemic. So as fate would have it, we decided to pull the manuscript back from submission, not to leave it out there or not to put it in the hands of editors who maybe weren't in the right frame of mind to be taking on any manuscripts at that moment. New York was completely shutting down to publishing. So we pulled it back from submission. I was already working on my second Alex Martel thriller, and that became Perfect Shot. So luckily, we went out about a year later with that, and it was picked up in 2022, what they call picked up, which means I was offered a 2-book deal in 2022. So very fortunate to have that with Minotaur Books, as you said, which, as you know, is the home to Louise Penny and so many great authors. So I'm very happy to be with Minotaur, and yeah, that's kind of how I started and how I got towards my first book and getting published as well.
Well, it's wonderful. I'm just going to interject here.
Sure.
So the manuscript you had that you took down, that you withdrew, how much of that came into Perfect Shot, or is it a completely different story now that you're going to keep and maybe use at a later date?
Yeah, it's a completely different story. It was the first in the series. So what it really meant was Perfect Shot became the first in the series. And I wasn't very far into it when we knew we were going to be pulling By a Long Shot back. So it didn't take much to make Perfect Shot the first in the series. By a Long Shot, is sitting in a drawer somewhere essentially, or on the shelf behind me. And I've been thinking about bringing that out. It might fit in, God willing, I get another book deal and maybe another one after that. So my third and fourth book, I'm writing my third book now. Fourth book is already planned as well. So I'm thinking if I have time, I'd love to make By a Long Shot maybe the fifth or sixth in the series. So it would take some massaging because circumstances have changed, certainly for Alex and the crew that she was with in By a Long Shot. But I'm thinking it might squeeze in maybe around book 5 or book 6 with, fingers crossed.
All
So
right. You've definitely got lots of plans then. I had got lots of ideas for what Alex is gonna get up to in the next few years.
absolutely.
So very exciting. Okay. So before we I guess one thing I'm going to ask you is what is one of the most exciting or nerve-wracking situations you've ever been in? And did you write that into Perfect Shot, or is it maybe something that's going to get written into a future book?
Yeah, in a 30-year career, there are, I suppose, an awful lot of nerve-wracking and high-octane moments. But I would say, if I had to think about one of the most challenging calls, I mean, there's lots of times, your heart's in your throat. You can be pretty frightened. I've gone to a lot of shooting calls and a lot of homicides. My first homicide was the very first summer I worked. I was about 20 years, I was 20 years old still. So I was just a kid. So you do see a lot of things as a paramedic. There's a lot of calls that certainly get your blood flowing pretty fast. But I would say one of the most fear-inducing calls, and probably many of the people on this call would remember it, was when they were building the Scotia Tower in 1986. I believe it was 86, might have been 85, but around that time. And during the construction phase, there was a construction accident with an elevator where the elevator shot to the roof of the building. And the circumstance, it was tragic. It was a Sunday morning, 6:30 in the morning. I was actually at Toronto General Hospital. We had just brought another patient in. and there's a direct line, what's called a direct line, so a hotline, a bat phone, whatever you want to call it, in the ambulance crew room at Toronto General. And it rang, and I picked it up and answered with our unit number. And they said, if you're clear, we have a call right down the street from you. You'll be second into an incident at a construction site. So we were told it was an elevator accident. When I arrived on the scene, I expected the elevator to be sadly on the ground. It wasn't. Then I found out what had happened was the 10,000-pound counterweight, the brakes on that failed. And as the elevator started to go up and the counterweight started to come down, the counterweight kept accelerating, shot the elevator up to the roof, or wasn't the roof at the time. It was an I-beam that basically, supported the elevator. Well, we went up, and sadly, 2 people perished in that incident. 3 were critically injured, and then we packaged the patients to bring them down. Well, the only way down was in a sister elevator right next to the elevator that had just had the incident. So getting into that elevator, I would say, and of course, while we're working up there, all the floors are open. There was no walls. It was completely wide open. So it was quite an experience being 44 stories up, doing what we were doing, trying to take care of people. And then, the realization that we were coming down in a sister elevator to the elevator that had just crashed was pretty frightening. So that will never make it into a book. It's certainly a moment of my career that I remember and I'll never forget, but probably no way to work that into a story. Although I do have in my first book, By a Long Shot, there was an incident involving a crane. And so that if that book comes out, there'll be a crane incident, not too different than the one I faced on the job, but not quite the same. So that was a long time ago now. It was 1986, but that one's memorable for sure.
So obviously, as a paramedic and being a tactical medic for the OPP, you have had a lot of experiences, and you have pulled a lot of that into, I guess, into the story. So, I mean, I don't read a ton of thrillers. It's not my normal genre. So it's very exciting for us to have um, to be discussing a thriller book this evening. It's our first one. I don't, like I said, I don't read a ton of them, but this one had me on the edge of my seat the whole time,
Thank you.
and there was a lot of details. So, I mean, how closely factually perfect were you in the details that you wrote about? Like,
Yeah, and so it's interesting because I wanted to blend. Growing up, my first love was science fiction. My very early on, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Frank Herbert with the Dune series. I was very much a sci-fi lover. And then as I got into my teens, I migrated into other genres. And then in, I guess, the early 80s, suddenly there's this guy, Robert Ludlum, and another guy, Tom Clancy. And I fell in love with those stories, and I became really enamored with the thriller slash espionage series. And of course, I loved James Bond growing up. My dad always had Ian Fleming books on the shelf and John le Carré. So I love those books. So when it came time to write, and knowing I wanted to write something that I'm familiar with, I was able to blend my love of thrillers and espionage thrillers in particular with my knowledge of police operations, SWAT operations, and tactics. So in the book, there's another. I was at a conference last summer, and someone asked a similar question about reality and realism in my stories, and I call it truth adjacent. I might have stolen that phrase from somebody, I don't know, but I like using the phrase truth adjacent, which means I write as close to the line of reality as I can, but with enough sort of believability or enough room for doubt, or, enough room for a reader to say, is that real or is that fictitious? So I don't blur the lines when it comes to weaponry and tactics. I stay pretty true to the craft. I don't invent things that don't exist. I don't make people do really silly things. I try to keep people's actions pretty close to the way they are. Um, and with the tactics that Alex uses in Perfect Shot, she's a sniper in the story with a background as a combat medic, which of course I draw on from my own history. Um, so that's very much built and based on actual skills of long-range precision shooters or snipers. So there's a lot of Oh, and the other side, I guess, is the locations. One of the things I love is that I love to travel. So almost every location in the book, except in Turkey and Moscow, but every other location in the story, I was at I was in those locations, and to the point where if I say there's 7 stairs going up to Lloyd's Bank on Threadneedle Street in London, you can go to Google Street View and count the number of steps. And I actually had somebody do that, count the number of steps, and get back to me and said, "Yep, there were 7 steps." Or whatever it was. So I love the reality and the realism of locations because when I read, I love to be able to visit a location that I've read about in a story. Whether it's Dan Brown, his book, not Angels and Demons, the Da Vinci Code. So whether it's to visit those locations or others that I read about, I love to trace the steps of the fictional characters that I've read about. And so when I'm writing, I very much try to keep that same realism in the story when I write. And I might deviate somewhere else, diffusing a bomb or doing this or that. Maybe I don't give all the actual factual steps, how to render a device safe, but I try to stay close to the facts.
There you go. Well, that's great. Well, that answers a couple of questions that were in there. So one of them was about all the detail that you had in about the Lloyd's Bank. And the question was, do you have a bank account there, or did you have a safety deposit box there to know all the intricate details of that building? So, and the reader did say, or the writer of the question did say that they would love to go and visit it and just and see for themselves. So the description was beautiful. So do you did you ever go into the bank
I
to, I know you said you had someone count the steps for you, but I'm just wondering if you actually went into the bank and all those details are
Well, I
obviously
can't. I
included.
counted the steps myself, and then they counted it later to see if I was lying or not. So I did count the steps myself. The day I went, so I was in London. Like I said, I've been into all the locations: St. Stephen's Tavern, Shoreditch Grind, coffee shop, all those places. Um, when I was in London, the day I went to go to investigate Lloyd's Bank, they were closed. So there's me up against the windows, staring through the windows of the bank. I was expecting the police to show up any moment now to ask why I was so intent on getting into the bank. So I had to do a little guesswork on the what the interior layout looked like. I could see the wickets, but I took some liberties with, the downstairs vault, things like that. But as far as the location went, no, there is a Lloyd's Bank right at that
Yeah.
location. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Wonderful. Now you do go into a lot of detail. Like it's great the what people are wearing. So that you book is definitely, like I said, fairly detailed. Like the watches that are on people's wrists. I mean, I was just wondering when every time I was reading a passage of that, I wanted to know whether or not you are a watch aficionado. If that's sort of a side passion of yours that because you're again right from the coats to the make of their clothes to the various things, you added in a lot of detail. And I know sometimes in books too much detail turns people off, but your detail, you were not so overly detailed, but all the details were really how you wove them into the story were really fascinating.
Well, I've been married now for what year is this? Going on 36 years this summer. And my wife is my first reader, my first editor, my first critic, my biggest supporter. But she reads a ton. She reads across multiple genres. She loves to read. She's very good at identifying in my writing if I've gone overboard in description. So she's also a college professor. So she has a red pen that she's not afraid to use if I ask her to. So when I'm finished writing, and she rarely reads sort of during my writing, unless there's a paragraph that I'm having trouble working out. But when I hand her the, 380-page manuscript at the end, she has no problem stroking, excess descriptions out. So when it comes to the weapons and things like that, I think probably some people who aren't used to it might get turned off a bit. Go ahead and skip it if it's too much. But I do try to tone that down somewhat. The interesting thing about the thriller genre, especially espionage, espionage, the world of espionage and spies in general, they're very watch oriented. And if anyone is interested in pursuing that further, there's a website and a newsletter called Watches of Espionage, or WOE. It's called Watches of Espionage. They put out a weekly newsletter. It's run by a former CIA intelligence officer. And they talk about the role of watches in the world of espionage and special operations and special forces. And it's a very unique thing among that community that finds its way into the writing, how much they are focused on watches as tools, not just as, they wouldn't wear a fancy watch just to wear a fancy watch. Well, some might, of course. But in the intelligence world and the special operations world, they wear watches as tools. Sometimes it's just to tell time. Sometimes it's to have a little bit of wealth on your wrist. So if you have to buy your ticket out of the country because you're about to be in a jackpot kind of situation, then you can hand over your Rolex for uh, stowage on an ocean liner or something. So there are tools. So it's a funny thing. It's peculiar to the thrillers. Um, that they do like. If you read Tom Clancy, if you read any of the Robert Ludlum stories, you'll hear a lot of mention about specific brands of watches. And if you watch, whether it's James Bond or again the Tom Clancy, the Jack Ryan and Jack Ryan Jr. series, they spend a lot of time focusing on exactly what watch, what make of watch those characters will be wearing. And my wife thought it was bizarre at first when she started reading the description. And you have to be careful because you can throw a lot of description that's useless into a story and turn people off. But I do put a little bit about watches into the story just to as a nod to the traditions, but as a nod to the readers who are expecting to see something and some mention of certain watches in the stories as well.
Very interesting. Well, I certainly found myself Googling about the various watches that you were writing about because I thought you're either an aficionado, but I'd never heard that that was something watches got written into thrillers before. So very, very fascinating. Now you brought up your wife, Lynn, and I know at the very back of the book you say she's sort of one of the inspirations for the Alex Martell characters. Can you tell us a little bit more about the other women that also inspired you to write about Alex? I think when you and I had a conversation at the bookshop, what your plan wasn't to have a female protagonist. It
That's
was,
right.
yeah. And also just a second side of that to go on is how hard was it for you to write a female character?
Sure. So it's funny because the world I worked in as a paramedic, as a tactical medic, a SWAT medic, I worked with a lot of women, and it didn't matter that they were women. They were doing the exact same job as I was doing, or the exact same job the other police officers, the male officers were doing. So there was no real distinction in that sense between the role of a woman paramedic and a male paramedic, or the role of a female police officer, tactical or otherwise, and a male police officer, tactical or otherwise. So I had those examples for over 40 years. I've been in the workforce for over 40 years. And my wife, Lynn, as I mentioned, she, for 30 years, ran the paramedic program at Humber College. And before that, she was a paramedic on the road back in the 80s, back when there were almost no women. 1 in 100, 1 in 200 paramedics were female. So she was a groundbreaking, trailblazing medic herself. So I didn't have to look very far. Um, when I mentioned in the acknowledgments, I debated actually whether I should do that because I thought some people might read that and find it patronizing that I'm talking about women as being the trailblazers and the strong people they are in the back of the book. But I thought, no, I want to give credit to where credit's due. And one example is one of the people I mentioned. She's also from, I won't mention her name because it's in the credits of the book, but she's also in Etobicoke. She was an Etobicoke resident for years, grew up in Etobicoke, raised in Etobicoke, raised her family in Etobicoke, worked out at 22 Division, was one of the first female police tactical officers with the ETF, the Emergency Task Force in Toronto, one of the first female canine officers in Canada as well. So again, a trailblazing person that I worked with almost every day. I would do calls. She was with Toronto Police, I was with Toronto Paramedic Services, but we would respond together to these, quite often high octane calls. And I got to see how she operated not only as a police officer, but as a leader because she was a sergeant. So she had a whole platoon that reported to her. So I had lots and lots of examples throughout my entire career of working with women, at a high level. And the question begs, I don't like describing my character as a strong female protagonist simply because what's the alternative? I'm not writing, if I'm writing about a man, I don't say I'm writing about a strong male protagonist. I'm writing about a man who's a whatever. And so I resist the sort of tendency in writing commercial fiction or any type of fiction really to describe women as strong female protagonists. Well, that's the expectation. They're either an unreliable narrator, or if they're not, then they're a strong female protagonist, and everything except the word protagonist is kind of redundant. So I try not to do it. Um, and I didn't set out to write, as you mentioned, a female character. I just fell into it. And the way I fell into it was I don't plan my stories, I don't outline, I don't plot. I simply imagine a scenario, inject a character into that scenario, and then start to write. And wherever the story takes me, it takes me. So if I envision a trench-coated, pipe-smoking gumshoe, well, that's the beginning. And that's all I have in my head. And then I start to write the story. And I started actually probably a dozen, 10, 20 stories featuring male protagonists that just didn't go anywhere. The story didn't take off. The story didn't come to me. I could write a few pages of great description, but nothing was happening and I couldn't make it happen. And then one day I started writing a story set in Amsterdam. And, the setup was there's a body found in the canal. Police are fishing the body out of the canal. There's two detectives on the scene, and then a Volvo rolls up with a female investigator in it. And when I introduced her to the story, suddenly I had a character that I could write. And that was 10 years ago, and she became, even though that story didn't go anywhere, that character evolved into Alex Martell. So her name was Rachel Danaher, but it was only within the last year or two that I found that old manuscript. And when I read the story and the description and how she was and how she interacted with the other characters in the story, I realized that was the first Alex. And that was 10 years ago. So it took a while to build that and develop it into who Alex Martell is today. Your other question that's along the same lines is, so to answer that question, no, I never set out to write a female character. She just kind of appeared in my writing and I went with it. And then the last part of that question was, do I find it difficult to write a female character? And I would say not anymore. Maybe in the beginning, maybe she was twisting her hair in the mirror too much or fixing her makeup or whatever it was. I hope I wasn't that cliche, but I'm sure I had some cliches in my writing. As I mentioned who my first reader was, Lynn was pretty quick to strip away those cliches and make sure that I wasn't staying on that path. So really, when I think about writing Alex, I'm not writing a female or a male. I'm writing hopefully a good deep character. And yes, there are times when I have to put her in a dress or I have to describe what she's wearing or her hair or whatever it is. I do struggle a bit. Google has some interesting searches from me on record about women's clothing and shoes. But also Lynn, my wife, has been very helpful in helping me fill in the blanks where I might be running off the rails a bit.
Excellent. Well, thank you. So then go again within the story, you decided to have a nuclear warhead stolen. So is that and fascinating, but it's very timely with everything that is going on in the world right now and all the threats we've got, what we've got going in with Russia and Ukraine and what we've got going on with Israel and Iran. I mean, is that is, you chose to write about nuclear. You've got all the experiences that you've got, but you chose to write about nuclear first. Do you feel that is one of the biggest threats we've got out there at the moment?
Yeah, I do. And so you were saying it, I don't remember if I fully expanded on it, but one of my I'm highly trained in the area of CBRNE response, incident response, which is chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosives incident response. And I went to Harvard for a program in radiological emergency management, radiological emergency planning. And so I've studied nuclear terrorism, radiological terrorism, things like that. I have a magazine I get monthly called CBRNE News, which is a magazine for the trade that talks about these types of incidents. Mostly they deal with chemical and biological incidents, but they also talk about radiological and nuclear. My last job, I was a commander of the province's disaster response team. One of our mandates was response to nuclear incidents. So we have to plan constantly around responding to not, and when we say nuclear incidents in that respect, it's not a nuclear bomb going off, but it's a meltdown scenario at a power plant. It's a radiological event at a power plant. So those are described as nuclear incidents. So I do have a lot of a background in that. I also have a bit of a background in the sense that my parents were Hungarian and lived under the Soviet regime in Hungary until the revolution in 56. So it's easy for me, and I lived in Hungary for just for a summer, excuse me, for 3 months in the summer. So I got to see what it was like to live under the Soviet regime in 1975 or so, and what that felt like for the people there, and what that felt like even as a Canadian being there for a short time, just one summer. So all those things came together to make me dream up. Well, again, so fast forward, package all that knowledge and experience into this bald head of mine. And when I was coming up with a story, there were a couple of things I wanted to emphasize. One was I knew who Alex was, and I wanted people to know who Alex was. But I thought I need a high stakes adventure for Alex to set the bar with, to get going with. No one wants, I didn't think Alex, was going to solve a local homicide. I thought it had to be something, one of the things you read about when you're reading about writing, they say sometimes there's different genres, but in my genre, come up with high stakes, Mission Impossible, high stakes, the world's going to end. Nothing is about, the corner store gets robbed. This is world ending stuff. So I thought, okay, I've got Alex Martel, my character. How can I make the stakes of this story high? So it was about a third of the way into the story before again, because I don't plot, I don't plan, I don't outline. I'm what's called a pantser. I write by the seat of my pants. So when I was writing forward, as I'm progressing, I'm thinking, okay, this is great, but I've got to come up with, what's it going to be? And then I fell into the topic of, it started with the beginning of the story. There's an exchange of nuclear or radioactive or radiological materials. So I thought, how can I make that part of the story? And I thought, well, do I make it so that they take that material and they build a warhead, or do I go higher? Do I have someone steal a thermonuclear weapon? And that's where my brain took me, was, yeah, this is big stakes. It's timely in the sense that I mentioned the magazine that I read because it always lists events around the world where radiological materials have been stolen, or chemical weapons, or whatever else. So it tracks all the incidents globally. So these things, the exchange of radioactive or radiological materials, happens much more often than people would be comfortable knowing.
Yes, well,
So
I just hearing that makes me nervous. Wow. So
So thankfully, there are people who work in the shadows to prevent bad things from happening, the Alex Martel type characters. And actually, what's interesting about this story, because I wrote this book, I've become friends with a number of CIA officers, past and present, and one of whom literally saved the world from a thermonuclear doomsday. His name is James Lawler, officer. He's an intelligence officer. He was the chief of the nuclear branch of the CIA's counterproliferation department. Um, he is a legendary figure, and he befriended me last year, and we've become quite good friends since. But anyway, it was all because I wanted high stakes, and I had a little bit of knowledge, and then the research took me further along the path that gave me the ability to write somewhat authoritatively about it,
okay, excellent.
without giving away, sort of national security secrets.
Well, and that's a great segue into the next question that came in. So, sorry, I've dealt with that one. It was to deal with the security details and how much, yeah, the number of places in the books you wrote about security details, were they made up to prevent giving away sensitive information?
So
So,
when it comes to that's, it's funny because this gentleman just wrote, he wrote a fantastic blurb. And if people find go to my Facebook or search through it, he sent me a blurb. He actually posted it online, said, I have a lot of experience in the area of, nuclear terrorism. And I can't confirm or deny the accuracy of what Steve writes about, he said, but I can confirm that I felt the same frisson of fear reading about his story that I felt many times throughout my intelligence career. So that was a real pat on the back. But to answer the question, um, everything that appeared in the book is in the public domain. So if I have any knowledge that exceeds the public domain, it didn't get into the story. And even some of the things that are in the public domain regarding the specifics of the weapon, the nuclear weapon in this case, I changed a little bit about while I was writing it just to prevent someone from, I mean, they're not going to be able to create a nuclear weapon or steal one based on that. But I just fudged enough of the details to keep people with, evil intent maybe take them 5 minutes longer to find the information they want. Maybe they'd give up by then. But when it comes to security elements, I list tactics and techniques of police operations, tactical operations, shooting, whatever it is. Those I'm pretty sort of true to life to. But if it comes to higher security levels, nothing that's not within the public domain made it into the story.
Perfect. All right.
Or if they did, I disavow any knowledge of it. I mean,
There you go. Well, it's all those little details to me that make it such a fascinating read. So now I'm going to get into some very specific questions that came in.
sure.
So first one is Alex has a notion that loyalty had always been her strong suit, never her burden, and that was on page 287. Do you share that sentiment?
A lot of what I'm going to deflect the question while I think about it, but a lot of Alex and I write a lot of myself into Alex and Caleb. And my experiences over the last 40 years around the topics of, how I interact with the public, the stresses of the job, without going into the PTSD, I don't think I mentioned, I think Alex sort of disavows PTSD at some point in the story. Says I'm nobody's PTSD poster child. And I would say that, in general, most paramedics, most police officers who've been acting or working for a long time, in fact, most of those public service and public safety professions, everyone deals with demons. And I channel a lot of my demons into Alex and Caleb and give them their deep thoughts and sometimes their dark thoughts. When it comes to loyalty, um, I don't know so much if it's me or just what I've seen over time that loyalty is one, it's underrated. To me, it's one of the most important qualities a person can have and exhibit is loyalty to another person, whether that's within a marriage, whether that's in a working partnership, whether that's within a team of operators in the military or police or special operations in whatever community. Loyalty is critical. But I think loyalty in that context, in the story, can be a burden because there are people, malign actors, bad actors out there who will take advantage of people's loyalty. Sometimes it's simple as a psychopath or a sociopath. Sometimes it's more complicated than that, a true criminal element, a criminal mind rather, who does just enough to become a loyal person or show themselves to be loyal, but really their whole intent is to manipulate later. So loyalty by itself, I find extremely important, but I also think that there are people out there who take advantage of that, and that therefore that gives that, that element of burden to Alex that she thought that was, loyalty was something that she values. She'd never considered it necessarily to be something that could be a burden. But now, because of the events of the story and the circumstances she's faced with, that's something that she has to certainly give thought to.
Yes, and especially and the whole Kristen storyline in there with all the
Exactly.
clues and everything going to the safety deposit box and everything. And again, that whole encryption of how it all got coded, and you have the code breaker who's working through the photographs to see what they can pick up, and the Titan 1 and Titan 2 and the names of who who the bad guys are coming through. So, and again, Kristen at the end, obviously, she got the better, like what she explained in her letter. It's
Mhm.
just fascinating, the whole loyalty. I guess she had to live with herself to the very end.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I think even for people who are bad, bad,
Yeah.
in the sense of the intelligence community or betraying their countries, they're not always necessarily that bad. They might not be the evil people we think they are. Should they? I don't want to give any quarter to people who betray their countries, but they're not always the animals we assume they are, and they do it for different reasons. And maybe they do it for loyalty that's different than what our interpretation of what loyalty should be.
Yeah.
So it's a complicated world. Intelligence has always fascinated me. The world of espionage has always fascinated me for that reason. The motivations that make someone betray their country, or the motivations that make someone stand up for their country.
Yeah, definitely. So another one on page 168, you say one does not win hearts and minds. One seizes control of a country with brute military force, strategic and tactical domination of essential infrastructure, and the subjugation of its people. It had taken a while, but even Russia had learned this lesson from history. So the individual that wrote in this question, were you thinking about Ukraine when you wrote this? But
Well, yeah, so I wrote the story. You have to remember the context. I wrote the story from roughly January 2020. I was finished by July 2021. So a full 7 months before the invasion, 8 months before the invasion, Russia invaded Ukraine. So really, I wasn't thinking of that. But as I mentioned before, my background being of, Hungarian descent, born in Canada, but of Hungarian parents, my father was on the to be killed list that the Russians had. So they went through, my parents lived in different parts of the country. They had met, but my father was a student who had been thrown out of university in Budapest because he was an assistant director on a play that was, I don't know what the story was, to be honest with you, what the story was about, but he and the director portrayed the Russian um, leaders as corrupt. It was all an allegory to the play. And the university threw my dad out of university for that. So when the revolution broke out, he joined the revolution and was a radio operator trying to get help from the West, calling to the West to try to come help Hungary in the 2 weeks that they had cast off the Soviet yoke, as it were. So in that sense, I forgot the question already. Oh, so in that sense, I have that in my mind. There are bad actors in this world, and we certainly have seen Russia's bad. Now, everything's confused these days because people take sides oddly, different than what we would have seen 20 years ago, because a lot of people support Russia. A lot of people think they're great. I'll never share that. I was never lulled into a false sense of security when the Berlin Wall came down. But so I always have I have a devious mind that always think there's, bad nations, bad countries, bad actors out there. So I just dig into that little part of my brain that sees the way some people or nations try to manipulate others.
yeah.
I'm a deep, Darby, a deep, deep, devious, dark, sick mind, I suppose.
Okay, thank you. Um, American exceptionalism. So this was
Yes.
another, article or a question that came in. And the belief that the U.S. Is either distinctive, unique, or exemplary compared to other nations. That's I guess, for someone who doesn't know what American exceptionalism is. And then you had Gerasimov think about American exceptionalism a couple of times on pages 168 and 326. But is it a negative to have him, is that to be deemed American exceptional is a bit of a negative thing nowadays, but you had a Russian individual thinking about it in your book. Was that on purpose? Like, I mean, obviously what you read in there, but was that a subtle message you were trying to put out?
Yeah, and it's always, and I don't want to get myself in trouble. I love America, but the notion of American, so first of all, I'm not an academic on the topic. My knowledge, I'm sure there are philosophers who could expand and expound upon what that really means much more deeply than I can. But when I think of anyone, nation or person, thinking of themselves as exceptional in the truest sense, meaning that they're above everybody else, I think that's dangerous. So I think America is a superpower and has been an important superpower. And yes, we could argue it comes with negative, associations and problems and all that. Absolutely. But they have been a superpower, and they have been they've kept the world peaceful basically since World War II. And again, all kinds of caveats and footnotes and whatever else. But when that makes people, Americans, think of themselves as exceptional in the sense that their nation is above the law or above everybody else. And I'm not trying to dive too deeply into this or over philosophize about it, but I think you can take that too far. And we've seen people take that too far to believe that their country, or again, justifying their own actions rather than just the actions of a nation, you can take that too far. And you can see, and even if you can't, you can see how other nations and leaders might really grow tired of coming up against that notion all the time and really wanting, especially if you're the underdog. If somebody, whether you're a kid at high school and you love hockey, but you're not quite as good as this guy because he's 6'4" and you're only 5'2", you can see you want to get up there and knock this guy off his block at some point if you've got any competitiveness in you. So even if you approach it from the standpoint of any level of competition, then it sets up an interesting dynamic. But I thought, again, if I put myself in the brain of a dictator or a zealot for a cause, what would they be unhappy about? And on a nation state level, they'd be unhappy for sure about how the US is viewed globally, but also how they view themselves. So I picked that phrase because it's been around and kicked around a lot and discussed a lot. So
Perfect. In chapter 25, you quote Isaiah 6-8 and talk about Alex adopting St. Michael, the patron saint of warriors and police officers, as her protector. Has church and Christianity played a role in your life?
oh, that's a tough one. Yes and no, but maybe not in the best way possible. I I have my beliefs. I have my own spirituality. I went to Catholic school. I went to Catholic high school. I went to St. Michael's. Um, but I also, but I'm not a practicing Catholic. We brought our kids up. My wife is a Presbyterian. We brought our kids up in the Presbyterian church, took them to church. So we gave them a mixed sort of Christian upbringing. But I'm a bit of a, I've stayed away from organized religion for a while, just because some of the examples I've seen haven't always been the best examples. And this is not to paint people in general. And of course, this is a church group. And I love people who go to church and I love people of the church. But for me personally, I don't find or take comfort in practicing my faith. And it could be because of the background I have, whatever it is. I try to be a good person, but I would not say that I've been a great practicing Christian most of my life. So, but as you can see, I recognize elements in the Bible and in spirituality that are important. Service is important. And that phrase, send me, that's a very important phrase in the Bible that, though I'm not a practicing Catholic or a church going man, I believe very much in that Isaiah 6:8 doctrine of send me. Who will go? Send me. And I've answered that call all my life. And I believed in that from the time I was a teenager. I thought it was very important to serve my fellow man and women, obviously, but to serve humanity. And I chose being a paramedic to do that. But I would not say that I've been a good practicing churchgoer all my life.
Okay, great. Didn't mean to put you on the spot
Yeah,
there.
it's a challenging question I've never been asked, and it's a careful answer because I'm not anti-religion. I just don't find, for
Yeah,
me, I haven't been successful at it.
yeah. But that particular, like, send me, it was so powerful within the book, definitely.
And I
So
think it's important. I mean, I think it's important both in the book to understand Alex's motivations, but also I think it's important in general. And after I wrote that, sometime after I finished the book, I'm trying to remember, I think another book came out with the title Send Me. And it's actually something that's quite big now in special operations in the military. So it's interesting how people have seized on that line because it really speaks volumes about service to humanity.
yeah, definitely. Now I'm just cognizant of the time, and we're getting close to the 8 o'clock time frame. But there's a couple of questions that are near the end of the book that I guess, left people a little bit hanging and they wanted a few more details from you. So, the one question is, why is there no explanation as to why Caleb did not continue on the flight to North America and how he managed his timely entrance into the catacombs to save Alex? So, did you purposefully leave that detail out for Caleb to show up, or like it was all of a sudden he was on this plane going and wasn't going to follow Alex, and next thing he's in the
Yes.
tunnel of under Paris to help out. So it was just like, why did you not bring in that whole Caleb
Yes.
storyline into it?
So I thought it was important to leave that hanging and leave the reader hanging because I wanted them to realize that, Caleb was fighting on two fronts. Caleb was fighting loyalty to his duty in his country and loyalty and affection or whatever it is for Alex, something burgeoning between him and Alex. So I wanted that, he's upset when they're stopping the plane and she's getting off and she's doing this and he's mad at her because he doesn't want her throwing away her career. He doesn't want her doing things that are going to hurt her down the road. And he recognizes that he's been tasked with a duty and he's going to fulfill that duty and follow that order. So I need him to disappear into the sunset. And I did contemplate having a scene where he's thinking about coming back or he makes a decision to turn around. But I thought that would maybe spoil this. Well, it would spoil the surprise where he shows up in the tunnels inside the catacombs at the end. I wanted that to be a moment where the reader goes, ah, he did turn around. So to me, the reader can imagine what steps Caleb went through mentally to make the decision he did. And certainly in book 2, Out in the Cold, there's more questions about that are answered. But I think to me, it was important I leave that more suspenseful and as a tool for him to just show up. I thought it was more impactful that way.
Okay. And then one of the other more questions right at the very end is, in the epilogue, the reader wonders who were Alex and Caleb working for in the epilogue, since she was, literally stripped of her all credit and fired essentially from her job in the FBI. Has she actually joined Caleb in this special
Yes.
operation that he's setting up? Okay, so that
Yes.
was, yeah, he
So
has.
at the end of the story in the epilogue, she's now a member of that team.
That his elite team that he was
Yes,
trying to recruit her into to right
exactly.
all the way throughout the book.
And to me, the final line, that the the "don't call me shooter" kind of cliche that runs through the story, spine
Yeah,
of the story, and at the end when he says, "see you back at camp" or whatever, shooter, and she just accepts that. So
yeah.
to me, that's her accepting
Accepting
she's now part of that
that
team.
is part of his team and his role. Okay, so can you tell us a little bit more about Out in the Cold?
Sure.
Just give us a little teaser about what's coming out in November, because it's coming out in November.
It
So
is.
I'm
It's
excited about
coming
that.
out
It'll be here before
November.
we know it.
Yeah, November 12th. It's coming out. It's actually finally up on Amazon. You can go look it up on Amazon, or I shouldn't say that. I'm sorry.
No, you can actually look it up on novelspot.ca.
You can look it up on novelspot.ca. You can look it up on novelspot.ca. The full description should be there now,
Yep.
uploaded, and it essentially talks about how um, there are events taking place in Finland that make it look like, or seems Russia is causing trouble in Finland. The 31st member of NATO. And the US is being drawn into this potential growing conflict between Russia and Finland because of Finland's membership in NATO. So the story revolves around what's really happening. Is Russia really doing this? Is something else going on? Is someone else behind this? What's the reason that all these things are happening to Finland? And how will Alex get to the bottom of it before World War III starts? So without teasing out too much, we do see Alex again. We certainly see Caleb again, and there may be a few other people you'll recognize as well.
That is wonderful. Well, thank you very much for all your time and taking the time to answer all of our questions. It's a fabulous book, and really, really, like I said, I really enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward to the next one and the next 2, 3, 4, maybe.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
I
there you
hope
go.
so.
So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks everybody. I'd like to thank everyone else for coming and listening to this talk. And by all means, if you have anybody has any questions, they can reach out to me. My website is steveurszenyi.com, and there's a contact form there. Or they can also send an email to info@steveurszenyi.com or steve@steveurszenyi.com.
Steve, it's Maya. I just want to say thank you for taking us on an adventure that we might not have the chance to take. And Sarah always chooses for us a book that will stretch us and have us see the world differently. My husband's a military reservist chaplain. His best friend serves as the chaplain for special forces.
Hmm,
My dad's here tonight, and he served as the paramedic and the police chaplain in St. Thomas for 2 decades.
amazing.
So when we gather, when we come to a story, we bring our own experience to it. And I'm just so grateful to have heard some of your family story, your life story, to know that you're in our neighborhood. And we also know the struggles of people who give their life in service. And so to watch you channel that into creativity and into a long range plan, we just want to celebrate and bless you into that. And as well, you're the only author since we've started that's actually quoted scripture specifically. So I think that we don't usually put our authors on the spot about their faith journey. So you can put that down to know that it's not our common practice. But I guess as you hear those words about the call to serve, we want to honor and say thank you to you and bless you and to the people that you hold whose real life stories are connected to your stories that you're writing. And also to know that the words that sustain people in some of those darkest times are peace be with you. Do not be afraid, for I will be with you to the end of the age. So may that be for all of us as we hold the tension of our world and the call to be in service together for a better world. So thanks for sparking us tonight. And we look forward to what will come next in November. So bless you.
Amen. And thank you all very much.
Yeah.